welcome back to the Sullen Socialist. Today I want to start with Iran and the possible conflict that seems to be growing closer and closer and closer between the US and Iran. And there's no reason for it. Like, it's all complete nonsense, and it's been orchestrated by the US. The only possible reason is because Iran don't want to play US's game. They don't want to join in all the treaties and follow all the rules that the US wants to set, because the US thinks it rules the world. And of course the US doesn't like that. And historically you've seen what happens to countries that don't follow along. Syria, Iraq, Libya, all did things that the US didn't like, and look at the countries now. They've been completely trashed and torn apart by basically US drone strikes, US military actions, US sanctions. The same with Venezuela. Venezuela didn't want to play with the US's game, and the US has imposed ridiculous sanctions, which is a form of war, and basically turned the country on its end. And they were doing really well until the US put sanctions on them. And yeah, now the place is in disarray. Again, US. So looking back to Iran, there's no reason why the US really should be against Iran. And a lot of the complaints they make are bogus. But one of the biggest complaints that the US keeps making is that that Iran's funding terrorists. Well, actually, the US funds the terrorists. Iran's funding rebels. And the rebels that Iran are funding are fighting against the Taliban. They're fighting against Al-Qaeda. They're fighting against the people that the US is supposed to be against. So really, Iran and the US should be partners, because they're both fighting for the same thing. They're trying to stabilize the region, so they say, or so the US says, trying to stabilize the region, trying to create peace, trying to get rid of the terrorists. But the US is doing exactly the opposite. Iran's the one that's actually putting in the funds, putting in the people, backing the right groups that are working towards better solutions in the region. Whereas the US has put all its support behind Saudi Arabia, which is completely weird. Saudi Arabia is everything the US hates. Quite literally everything the US hates. They're an authoritarian state. They have a brutal leadership. They execute their own citizens in public beheadings, public executions. They have a very extreme form of religion in their political system, and they are promoting that throughout the region. This is what the US is supposed to be fighting against. These extreme groups, the extreme forms of Islam, the Saudis are funding them. These are the people that the Saudis are funding and backing and promoting throughout the region. And they are creating the instability that is in the region. This is being pushed by the Saudi government, and the US is backing them. Yet Iran, who are funding rebels who are fighting against these destabilizing forces, are being attacked by the US. It just doesn't make any sense. Now, the only thing that does make any sense is there's got to be some money involved. And Trump himself came out this week and said, when asked about why they were going to help Saudi Arabia, he said, oh, because they pay us cash. Which, again, it doesn't make any sense. Especially being September, and this is the anniversary of 9/11. Supposedly, the terrorists that committed the attacks on 9/11, majority of them came from Saudi Arabia. They were funded by people within that government, yet the US is backing the Saudis, and they're not backing the people who are fighting against the extremists that are in the region. It just doesn't make any sense. So what's going to happen with it, I don't know. Luckily, the majority of what used to be US allies throughout Europe aren't playing the game. They're not getting involved just yet. They're all staying out. They understand that it's all complete nonsense. France has been trying to renegotiate and try and calm the situation down. Iran's, considering everything that's happened, Iran's behaving themselves really well. They're being a lot more restrained than the US would be if it was the other way around. If it was the other way around, the US would have been throwing bombs all over the place already. But these other countries are a lot more restrained than the US. These are the adults in the room and should be listened to, and a lot more attention should be paid to what's going on down there. Whereas in the US and in the mainstream media, this is all being ignored, and it really needs to be taken up and addressed, because it's starting to get serious. And Iran is not Iraq or Syria or Libya. They are not going to take it lying down if the US attacks, and it will be a lot more disastrous than the current set of disasters that the US is overseeing now. Afghanistan's a complete failure, total failure. They did everything wrong, couldn't have done anything worse than what they did in Afghanistan. Nearly 20 years later, no progress, like zero progress. Iraq, again, complete disaster. The US committed countless war crimes, invading Iraq supposedly over 9/11 or links to 9/11. It was absolutely nothing to do with Iraq. 1 million people in Iraq have died, around about, civilians. These aren't soldiers, these are civilians. These are innocent people who had nothing to do with the extremists. And I'm not going to talk about Islam or Muslims, because that's bullshit. It doesn't exist. These are extremists. There are Christian extremists, there are Muslim extremists. But that's nothing to do with the religion, because you're not going to turn around and tell me that every single Christian is an extremist, because they're not. And it's just like every single Muslim is not an extremist. They're just normal people going about their lives in the way that they go about their lives. Leave them alone and they won't bother you. Yet the US is poking the bear with a stick and then wondering why it's biting back. And that's what happens. So a lot of things need to change. The US policy in the region needs to change, because everything that they're doing now is not working. Provoking Iran is the worst possible thing the US could be doing. So more diplomatic solutions. You actually need to find somebody who's got some kind of diplomatic skills to get out there and talk about it and get something done. It needs to be discussed, and going into another conflict is not in the world's interest, not in anybody's interest. It's not going to help anyone, except for maybe make a few executives a little bit more money. And what's the point of that? They've already got more money than they need now. So finding a better solution that works for everybody, it could be done. The US needs to give, because you can't just take. You've got to give a little bit. And just imposing more and more and more sanctions on a country that didn't deserve the sanctions in the first place is very counterproductive. But the US needs to do something. They need to take some stronger action diplomatically, not militarily. What they need to do is start pulling the military back and let the diplomats go in and do some good things instead of going and taking more lives, because taking more lives is not creating any friends. It's just creating more and more enemies, more and more terrorists. All right. Thanks for listening, and talk to you again soon.